The Awakening, Chapter 5. They formed a congenial group sitting there that summer afternoon. Madame Ratignolle swing away, often stopping to relate a story or incident with much expressive gesture of her perfect hands. Robert and Mrs. Pontellier sitting idle, exchanging occasional words, glances, or smiles which indicated a certain advanced stage of intimacy and camaraderie. He had lived in her shadow during the past month. No one thought anything of it. Many had predicted that Robert would devote himself to Mrs. Pontellier when he arrived. Since the age of 19, which was 11 years before, Robert each summer at Grand Isle had constituted himself the devoted attendant of some fair dame or damsel. Sometimes it was a young girl, again a widow, but as often as not it was some interesting married woman. For 2 consecutive seasons he lived in the sunlight of Mademoiselle Duvignet's presence, but she died between summers. Then Robert posed as an inconsolable, prostrating himself at the feet of Madame Ratignolle for somewhat crumbs of sympathy and comfort she might be pleased to vouchsafe. Mrs. Pontellier liked to sit and gaze at her fair companion as she might look upon a faultless Madonna. Could any one fathom the cruelty beneath that fair exterior? Murmured Robert. She knew that I adored her once, and she let me adore her. It was Robert, come, go, stand up, sit down, do this, do that, see if the baby sleeps, my thimble, please, that I left God knows where, come and read Daudet to me while I sew. Par exemple, I never had to ask. You were always there under my feet like a troublesome cat. You mean like an adoring dog. And just as soon as Ratignolle appeared on the scene, then it was like a dog. Passez adieu à l'envoi. Perhaps I feared to make Alphonse jealous, she interjoined, with excessive naivety. That made them all laugh. The right hand jealous of the left, the heart jealous of the soul. But for that matter the Creole husband is never jealous. With him the gangrene passion is one which has become dwarfed by disuse. Meanwhile Robert, addressing Mrs. Pontellier, continued to tell of his one-time hopeless passion for Madame Ratignolle, of sleepless nights, of consuming flames till the very sea sizzled when he looked his daily plunge, while the lady at the needle kept up a little running, contemptuous comment, Laquelle fraiseur grosse bête va. He never assumed too serious a comic tone when alone with Mrs. Pontellier. She never knew precisely what to make of it. At that moment it was impossible for her to guess how much of it was jest and what portion was earnest. It was understood that he had often spoken words of love to Madame Ratignolle without any thought of being taken seriously. Mrs. Pontellier was glad he had not assumed a similar role toward herself. It would have been unacceptable and annoying. Mrs. Pontellier had brought her sketching materials, which she sometimes dabbled with in an unprofessional way. She liked the dabbling. She felt it in satisfaction of a kind which no other employment afforded her. She was long wished to try herself on Madame Ratignolle. Never had that lady seemed a more tempting subject than at that moment. seated there like some sensuous Madonna, with the gleam of the fading day enriching her splendid colour. Robert crossed over and seated himself upon the step below Mrs. Pontellier, that he might watch her work. She handled her brushes with a certain ease and freedom which came, not from long and close acquaintance with them, but from a natural attitude. Robert followed her work with close attention, giving forth little ejaculatory expressions of acceptation in French, which he addressed to Madame Ratignolle. Mais ce n'était pas mal. Elise Jaconnet, elle a de la force, oui. During his oblivious attention, he once quietly rested his head against Mrs. Pontellier's arm, as gently she repulsed him. Once again he repeated the offence. She could not but believe it to be thoughtlessness on his part. Yet that was no reason she should submit to it. She did not remonstrate, except again to repulse him quietly but firmly. He offered no apology. The picture completed bore no resemblance to Madame Ratignolle. She was greatly disappointed to find that it did not look like her, but it was a fair enough piece of work, and in many respects satisfying. Mrs. Pontellier evidently did not think so. After surveying the sketch critically, she drew a bored smudge of paint across its surface, and crumpled the paper between her hands. The youngest came trembling up the steps, the quadroon following at the respectful distance which they required her to observe. Mrs. Pontellier made them carry her paints and things into the house. She sought to detain them for a little talk and some pleasantry, but they were greatly in earnest. They had now come to investigate the contents of the bonbon box. They accepted without murmuring what she chose to give them, each holding out two chubby hands scoop-like in the vain hope that they might be filled, and then away they went. The sun was slow in the west, and the breeze soft and languorous that came up from the south, charged with the seductive odour of the sea. Children, freshly before bellowed, were gathering for their games under the oaks. Their voices were high and penetrating. Madame Ratignolle folded her sewing, placing thimble, scissors, and thread all neatly together in the roll, which she pinned securely. She complained of faintness. Mrs. Pontellier flew for the cologne water and a fan. She bathed Madame Ratignolle's face with cologne, while Robert plied the fan with unnecessary vigour. The spell was soon over, and Mrs. Pontellier could not help wondering if there were not a little imagination responsible for its origin, for the rose tint had never faded from her friend's face. She stood watching the fair woman walk down the long line of galleries with the grace and majesty which queens are sometimes supposed to possess. Her little ones ran to meet her. Two of them clung about her white skirts, the third she took from its nurse, and with a thousand endearments bore it along in her own fond encircling arms, though, as everybody well knew, the doctor had forbidden her to lift so much as a pin. "Are you going bathing?" asked Robert of Mrs. Pontellier. It was not so much a question as a reminder. "Oh, no," she answered, with the tone